Hi, this is Paul. Aaron Wren had Miles Smith on his podcast today, and I listened to it, and I thought it was a good conversation. There were a number of points in there that I thought were worth bringing up. Miles Smith had written a piece in Mere Orthodoxy called Reading the Exvangelicals. To read it, you just have to sign in for a free account, and you can see it. The thesis, basically, he's a professor of history at Hillsdale College, so he's certainly not a progressive, or as we might say in the world today. He is writing about evangelical culture, and he set out to read as many exvangelical books as he can. And so he's been noticing patterns. And one of the patterns that he noticed is that a large amount of the exvangelical books that have come out are people who have been going to big box, personality-driven, charismatic, leader-driven evangelical churches. Now, he, in the beginning of this interview, readily admits that there's a bias in terms of publishing and attention with respect to these works. There is, in many ways, sort of a political axe to grind with respect to these works, and so these works will tend to get published and celebrated and promoted. Other people's, let's say, departure from evangelicalism to other conservative movements, such as conservative Anglican or Orthodoxy or conservative Catholicism. I guess I should say conservative Orthodoxy as well, because they are not conservative, non-conservative Orthodoxy. The more I get to learn that church movement in America, that many of these books have a political hue, and they sort of are there to reinforce. He doesn't exactly say this, but I think this. They are sort of there to reinforce a stereotype to reinforce a political narrative, that authoritarian. Well, there's a place in this. There's a place in this video. I'll jump into that. So basically, first he talks about clericalism. And when he talks about clericalism, he doesn't use clericalism in the sense of, let's say, a Protestant reformer would use clericalism. He's basically using clericalism, saying that, well, sort of like he says in his article, that many of these pastors of these churches are functional gurus, that they are authorities to themselves of their own. They're making up theology as they go. The idea of evangelical pastor as guru is good evidence of how deep-seated this clericalism was. In Sarah McCammon's The Exvangelical, she described the material she was given to address teen sexuality. It was generally written by ministers and often by men. There is nothing wrong with a book of human sexuality by a male pastor, but McCammon can be forgiven for retroactively wincing at the graphic depictions of copulation in a book written by Timothy LaHaye and his wife Beverly. In fact, the evangelicals believe, and many still believe, that the advice on the sex act is the prerogative of the pastoral office as evidence for clericalist culture run amok. Now, this is very interesting because, on one hand, I would have to say that Miles, I think he's right in many respects, but I just want to notice the modernist valence of the expert here, and sort of the Kuyperian sphere sovereignty here. Let's look to the pastor for what is there in terms of his sphere, and let's look to other spheres of expertise, other spheres of knowledge, other domains of knowledge, to find out what we should know in other areas. And part of that is just sort of common sense. Part of that is very much part of the modern period. But when he's talking about megachurch pastor as guru, I think it's helpful to take a step back and look at this along the lines of re-enchantment and a disruption of authority and a collapse of authority structures, to the degree that, well, God is at the top of the hierarchy, and so, shouldn't your minister, who you really imagine, just basically has an ear to God, tell you what's right in every domain of life? And so on one hand, most of us should say, yeah, but your pastor probably knows a lot about some things and not as much about other things, so maybe you should prioritize your hierarchies in terms of who you should listen to. But that sort of casts a blind eye on the natural way that human beings deal with hierarchy and are distinct sometimes anti-intellectual. Anti-intellectualism is a big factor of American culture, but also sort of this desire to the anti-institutional wave that has been going through. And again, people don't trust institutions for a reason, especially in terms of something like in the wake of COVID. There's serious decline in institutions. A little while ago, I'm not going to say anything out of school because I fully expect my sister to completely talk about this on her YouTube channel. My sister, who has struggled with health issues for a very long time, chronic fatigue, a whole bunch of things. After my sister died, she pleaded with me to turn to a plant-only diet. I mean, just pleaded with me, please save yourself, go to a plant-only diet, and so that you don't die like our sister and our father of a heart attack. Well, recently, she has now gone to a carnivore diet and is telling me the benefits and blessings of a carnivore diet and how I must go to a carnivore diet. Now, my sister isn't saying, "Thus saith the Lord," but my sister is my sister, and this is the kind of thing that she does. And I've known her all my life, and she's known me most of her life. And so my mother and I sort of understand and frame these admonitions that she gives us with respect to our eating habits. And then just today I was visiting with someone, and she was talking to me about, she's quite a bit older than my sister and myself, much closer to my mother's age, and she was talking to me about, how are you feeling and how are you doing? Well, I'm doing okay. And she just talked about some of, let's say, her bad habits in terms of basic health and exercise. And she said, what if I don't eat right, if I'm not disciplined how I'm eating, I don't really feel good. And so what I've really done is that I've really turned to many more vegetables in my diet. And then she talked about how when she eats her vegetables and eats less meat, and especially a lot less processed food. So you can see, this isn't one-on-one here. If I don't eat out a lot and I eat a lot of processed food, I feel crappy because there's all these chemicals in it. But if I sort of eat, let's say, pure foods or whole foods, then, I feel better. Now, I'm not saying these two views are mutually exclusive. What I'm saying is that we've had a collapse of institutional authority in our culture. And so it makes perfect sense that charismatic leadership would lead to cults of personality. Now, at the end of this video, they talk about Donald Trump, basically in the vein of a cult of personality. Maybe I'll drop that here because I think it really fits. And he's basically saying, people sort of want to attach this to slavery and all kinds of things. And really, it comes straight out of, let's say, the early 20th century mainline Christian Americanism, as Miles Smith calls it. So I'll pause and we'll drop that video in here.
He is the charismatic leader. He is the pope of his movement. It's the one guy thing. He's putting on a show. He resonates with evangelical because he resembles their leaders and the culture of evangelicalism itself, even if he came out of, mainline Protestantism.
That strikes me as completely right. I think for so many evangelicals, they really convinced themselves they were apolitical.
Mm-hmm.
We're working with George Bush to get, kids in Africa fed or whatever the heck it was at the time. And so many evangelicals told themselves, we're not doing politics. Why? Because we're doing it with George Bush, who's a compassionate conservative, and we're doing it in the service of, whatever NGO group, it might be. In the 19-teens, the Southern Baptist Convention was wildly involved with the U.S. going into World War I. And in fact, Criswell, one of these famous Baptist guys, said, look, the victory of democracy, a la Wilson, is the victory of Baptist. And so there's a reason why Woodrow Wilson had him sort of be almost a chief figure forming a chaplaincy corps. So I think the fact of the matter is this has been going on a long time. I mean, a certain type of Protestant has been deeply invested in Americanism, political Americanism, which is, I think, what Trump is an expression of.
Yeah, when at my church in New York, which was a really old Presbyterian church, mainline church on the Upper East Side, there's a plaque in the narthex that is a list of the honor roll of people from that congregation who served in World War I. There's nothing from World War II or any of that, but World War I is right there with like stars next to the people who died. That's a very interesting point about World War I.
Yeah, and so this, I think, Trump is an expression of that. What's interesting to me, you'll see this quite a bit. There's this, and actually, there's been a lot of leftist scholars push back against it. So good for them. I think if you want to follow one really great scholar on the left, Sam Hasselby is fantastic. But the idea that Trump's sort of downstream from like Southern religion and Southern folk religion and like the era of slavery, it's nonsense. I mean, he's a creation of the sort of liberal democratic Americanism that was really, had its sort of strongest champions in places like New York City and places like Boston. And so basically, there's a lot of that movement has left it to go secular. And so now there's just evangelicals, charismatics, whatever you want to call them, filling the void in the old Americanist kind of institutional world, Christian Americanism, which I think is a better term than Christian nationalism, by the way, for what Trump does.
So he goes through this thesis about clericalism, and again, I think there's a lot to it. There's no question that a lot of big box modern American evangelicalism is sort of leaning into cult of personality. And this isn't unique in terms of, I know some people very quickly want to jump on race with this. This has been true in African American churches for a very long time. You can go look up videos of Reverend Ike, and it's the case that generally speaking, if you have a white minister in a neighborhood and a black minister in the neighborhood, the black minister will drive a better car. And, I can compare myself to a pastor that is in a strip mall just up there who for a while was renting our space and stopped payment on his last month's rent to the chagrin of my counsel. But, I've had people in the neighborhood come by and say, boy, he really leans into getting the offer and getting the money out of people, and say, yeah, this is a pattern. But, in black churches, you'll usually have, the pastor and you'll have the first lady. And then you basically have a succession. The pastor's son will take over the pulpit, and intergenerationally the pastor will take over the pulpit. So there are a lot of cultural dynamics running under here. But in this next clip that they talk about, I really liked how he talked about not only do you sort of have an authoritarian strain, but you also get a rather anarchical strain. But again, this is not a new thing in American religion. I loved my conversation with Chris Green, and I am really looking forward to getting to know him better at the Northwestuary Conference in Olympia, Washington this coming September. And if you haven't watched that conversation, you should definitely watch that conversation. I made another clip of it today because the reason I make clips is because a lot of people, if they see an hour and a half or an hour and 3/4 with a name they don't know, they're kind of like, And even though in this little community, there's a number of you that will watch Randos conversations, and for many of you, Chris Green is a Rando or maybe just a step above a Rando because you don't know much about him. But the conversation itself was just outstanding. And I deeply appreciated and felt a lot of resonance with the theological work that he's doing. And one of the nice things is he's very conversant in Vervaeke's work and Ian McGilchrist's work and a lot of the stuff that we're looking at in the corner. But I'll pause now and drop that second clip in here too.
I think I'm reading David Platt's Radical now, which is a book that was in currency too. And I don't think David Platt's a monster or anything like that, but the book's kind of nutty. And I was thinking about this is a book. It has all of these prominent people who blurbed it. Russell Moore and Ed Stetzer, kind of these evangelical, bigwigs. And it hit me that so much of how evangelicalism works is based on a sort of Führerprinzip, the leader principle. And so there are evangelical leaders. And the problem is that if when you have people who are leaders, you really are still doing personality-driven church. Like, you're really not going to church, you're going to a personality. And so guess what? When a personality says, oh, that other personality is valid, you get kind of this soup, right? Of just kind of, we all may have some disagreements, but, we're all kind of doing the same thing. So if we all can kind of at least, agree to disagree on the stuff that we don't like or do like, you get basically, I don't want to call it anarchy, but you get the worst of anarchy and the worst of authoritarianism all in the same mix. And so you have a complete anarchy where the people actually aren't governing ideas or governing what they say, and at least the way Protestants have governed what comes from the pulpit. But you also have people saying things without any sort of corrective. So it's anarchy and authoritarianism all at once. And I think it may be one of the reasons why there's sort of a fracture going on in those groups. Now, like you've heard the fracturing of evangelicalism mentioned quite a bit in the discourse. And I think it's because it was always the worst of authoritarianism and the worst of anarchy kind of in one mix. There's very little serious churchmanship. I'll mention this. David Platt regularly he doesn't refer to his church community. He says his faith family. And so think about what that is. What do families have? Families have father figures. Families have paternal figures. And what else is a pastor other than kind of a chief pastor? And so I don't think this makes them sort of, meaningfully patriarchalist or whatever. But it does mean their idea of authority at the church is vested in this one guy, this one leader. And historically, ecclesiastical authority is more diffuse. Even Anglicans diffuse their authority. The bishop is not a prince. Presbyterians have plurality of elders. Lutherans have elders and pastors and synodical and district presidents who are sort of de facto bishops. So there's a diffusion of power in historic Protestantism that is completely not the case in at least these evangelical circles. And so when you get sort of, let's say, the Gospel Coalition had a lot of PCA people and a lot of SBCers kind of interacting, when they've basically agreed to not prioritize how they govern themselves in pursuit of the gospel, what you're prioritizing, what you're not prioritizing is governing the pastors. And so I think that's where you get this strange mix of clericalism and anarchy.
As you can see, instead of just sort of interstitially going through the clips like I usually do and talking over them and butting them all the way through, I just don't have a lot of time because I have a vacation and a vacation in the middle, a wedding in the middle of a vacation that's bearing down on me, and we're trying to. Unlike my last two trips to Europe, where I can sort of go there and there's a few events in there, but thanks to John Lumgar and Tayo, when I would go to the UK, these guys would have everything planned for me. Absolutely tremendous gift that they would give me. But, my wife and I have to plan out this whole thing, and none of us have ever been to Italy, and we're just trying to figure that stuff out. So I'm just trying to do some things. I run across a video like this, like, I want to talk about this, and I'd love for people to sort of talk about this because it gets into the exvangelical thing that's going on in the country, and sort of where I go with this is that, well, one of the things is I like the fact that Aaron talked about this, evangelicalism is very much sort of a sociological dynamic in many ways. And the religious impulses beneath that dynamic are, well, they're predictable and they're reliable. And so certain perennial patterns of religiosity will emerge. There's a much more major Christian YouTuber that is working on a video about Jordan Peterson's faith, and he's been sending me early copies of it and asking my opinion because he he knows that I've done a ton of work listening to Jordan, and so when he listens, he wants to sort of hear, did I get this right? Did I get this right? And asking for input. So I've been going back and forth with him on that. And probably when it comes out, you can guess who he is, but it isn't Jonathan Pageau, obviously. But one of the big things that Peterson did was sort of raise to our attention the fact that there are certain perennial responses and dynamics that happen in terms of religion and a culture. And those things don't go away. And so just like when people complain that, you know, people have their religion and politics all mixed up, I say, of course they do, because religion is dollars and politics is cents. Religion is always and politics is now. It's also the case that you're going to have the rise of gurus. And now what Miles Smith sort of says is that, well, but in our staid confessional churches, well, we don't have gurus. Pastors are held accountable to preach what the confessions say. There's sort of a theological fence, and pastors are held in there. Now, of course, for me, that part of this conversation was very interesting, because that's, of course, what's up for grabs in the Christian Reformed Church. And I think, you know, there's a lot to say about progressivism and sort of what has happened in many churches where people have sort of followed different lights and taken the church in different ways. Part of what I liked about this conversation is what Aaron and Miles were able to sort of bring to the surface. They didn't really strike on it very clearly, is that in many ways, these enduring aspects of civilizational Christian Americanism, I like that phrase, I'm going to steal that, civilization Christian Americanism endures on the right and the left. And so what you've really seen with, let's say, the main line has been, you know, a continued evolution, but of course it's a continued evolution that has sort of released itself to one degree or another, depending on the church, from, let's say, historic Christianity. So you can talk about that. But again, I think with the recession of modernity, confessions like the reformational confessions that we have in the Christian Reformed Church, one of which that I've started going through, that's not quite so simply done anymore, because we recognize now with, let's say, the coming on strong of the Orthodox and the Catholic and the Anglican, where their emphasis is, let's say, right liturgy. And when you get to that, especially with all of these, it's not just, let's say, the words. I remember having a conversation with a theologian who went sort of PCA to RCA. I think he's still in the RCA, but basically PCA to RCA to same-sex affirming in not a very long time. They slowly moved into higher and higher church Presbyterian. And what they were basically saying is that, well, what happens with evangelicals, and I think he's right, and again, read Molly Worthen's The Apostles of Reason. This was, of course, before her conversion. Evangelicals and confessionalists sort of try to keep the narrative thread by means of the confessions. And I'm not going to say that's a bad strategy. I don't even believe it's a bad strategy. I just believe that there are limitations to that strategy. And even in the Christian Reformed Church's fight right now, you can see some of the limitations of that strategy. Because the documents from the Reformation period and from the Canons of Dort, a little beyond the Reformation period, these are born of their conflicts. And so they're certainly using those to sort of try to maintain the narrative consistency, but history continues to bring challenges. And so the work of confessionalism is never done. And part of what this theologian said to me is that, well, high churches basically maintain themselves through their liturgy and in their practice, but it's like, okay, which practices? Because part of what has happened in our technological age, that now because I can remember my grandparents who were born at the beginning of the 20th century, and I had at least enough access to them to talk about the shape, and because I was always historically curious, to ask them questions about the shape of their lives in growing up periods in the running up before the First World War, which they talk about. Because again, there's a great book about the religious aspects of the First World War, which I read a number of years before the whole YouTube started, but it was really a very cogent book. Things have been so disrupted by how we live our lives. At our estuary meeting on Sunday, it's interesting. It's fun having a very similar group do estuary almost every week. You begin to see some conversations continue to reemerge. And because, at least from Living Stones, we have a number of people who are now grandparent age, they have a lot to talk about keeping families together. And so we talk about the fact that families are spread throughout the United States. People are watching this all over the world. Nets and jets have completely rewritten how we are catechized, how we are formed. And so even though, I can agree I'm on team confessionalism with Miles Smith, I don't think you go far enough just sort of saying, yeah, these evangelical big box churches are cults of personality. Yes. And I think you also have to bring in James Wellman's High on God, because part of the thesis of his book, and of course his past is in the main line, he looked at the mega churches and said, in a lot of ways they function a lot better than almost every other sort of church in America. And I know some people here sort of get a little nervous because they think I'm dismissive about Pentecostals or big box evangelicals. And I don't mean that to be that way at all, because one of the things that I was talking to someone about recently with respect to a lot of these things, I said, for the most part, most of these churches are really not doing well addressing the population that works with their hands, population with IQs less than, let's say, 130, populations who don't always read books, and that's most people in America. And one of the things that churches did quite well in the Middle Ages, and these groups hung on into the modern period, was part of the reason these churches had liturgies is because they could be memorized, not read every Sunday. The difficulty we have is that there's so much churn and there's so much other stuff grabbing our attention that especially the non-elites are really struggling church-wise. So I've been making just fair warning, when I'm on my vacation, I really hope to make a lot of membership videos. So if you're not a member, and I mean a $3 member here, okay? Not a no wait, no ads. No wait, no ads. That might be useless while I'm gone. But I'm going to go to Italy, and I'm going to see a lot of religious stuff. And I just know sparks are going to fly in my head. I'm going to see a ton of stuff. I'm going to have a ton of thoughts. And I'm going to want to get some of that stuff down. And it is super messy. And so I'm not going to post it on my main channel probably. I'll probably just post most of it in the membership section. We'll see. What I did today was, I thought was a super messy video. I posted it in the membership section just because I said, this is too messy. And Sam and Grim Grizz said, this wasn't that messy. So then I posted it to the main channel. Maybe I'll do that too. Maybe I'll post stuff to the membership channel sometimes. And if it gets a good response, maybe I'll kick it up to the main channel. But when I'm on vacation, I won't have a lot of time to make bookmarks and some things like that. So one of the videos that I made on, maybe I could just show you. So then I go to pull up that video, and then I see, oh, this video that I thought was not worth prime time is the number 1 out of the last 10 videos I posted. This happens all the time. I have no idea what makes for a good video. And I didn't even put a tremendous amount of work into the thumbnail. I don't understand. I don't understand how any of this works. I swear, I run the worst YouTube channel around. If someone, it's just true. It's I am just bumping my way along here. So I just changed the title on this video that's in the membership section, and I retitled it CRC Progressives Lost because the internet disrupted their monopoly on old mass media, meaning the banner. I was thinking about everything that had happened in the Christian Reformed Church, and I thought about the fact that, again, because I come from the CRC left, and I'm still connected by relationships and family, and I'm still connected into those networks, and they are, I mean, the level of anger and pain and alarm is just unbelievable. I mean, they are just absolutely besides themselves about what has happened now, because and again, I'm dumbfounded by this, because it was like, were you not paying attention? I guess if you looked at the video before, no, they weren't paying attention, because you could see all this coming in 2016 and even before that if you paid close attention. And then definitely you should have figured it out in 2022. And now when 2024 comes around, it's like, it's kind of I won't make analogies, that won't go well. So I was thinking about the fact that, well, how did everything get away from them when they had, in many ways, the commanding heights of power in the Christian Reformed Church? They always had banner editors that were in alignment and agreement with them. They always had sort of preferential tone at synods. And then they lost it. And I think about Kent Hendricks' comments about the conservatives didn't leave because the conservatives had hope, even though I think, again, Mo is correct that that a bunch of the more hardcore conservatives left during the women in office thing. But the conservatives didn't leave because they had the internet and they could organize. And of course, so much of the drama on the left right now is because Big Bad Abides, did this. And it's like, well, if you really want to look in those terms, they just completely kicked the butt of all one body and Hesed. And I don't look at it in those terms. I think that conservatives started it, and moderates said, yeah, this is a good idea, and they joined, and they just represented the bulk of a very moderate Protestant Calvinist denomination, which is what the Christian Reformed Church is. A church with a legacy of confessional attention, much more than the Reformed Church in America would often say, you guys are a confessional church, we're a constitutional church. And well, I guess that proved right. But part of what happened during the Women in Office days, there would be other magazines that would come around. There was Christian Renewal and Outlook, and Leo Peters would take out full-page ads in the Grand Rapids Press to complain about certain science professors at Calvin College. Now, with the internet, and especially in some ways, the more evangelical pastors in the CRC were much more comfortable with those internet tools, partially because they were younger. And whereas Ryan Struck could get Jake Tapper to talk about the Christian Reformed Church and mention Ryan Struck on CNN, a good number of CRC ministers could figure out how to use blogs and YouTube and organize that way, and basically water down the monopoly that something like the Banner had. And so I think in many ways there's also the story of formation, which we'll have to go into more, because that's a big piece of this. Similar to what I see in the CRC, the reason why Catholics and Orthodox and magisterial Protestants have been losing so much, let's say, market share of their people. Number one, the non the non-elite classes have in many ways been captured by popular media. They're being, and popular Christian media, evangelical media. And so that's a big part of it. Even though many of these megachurch pastors are houses unto themselves and authorities unto themselves, and I think Sam Tiedemann would agree with this, you don't see many of them breaking with things like the Trinity. You don't see many of them breaking with long-standing Christian Orthodox beliefs, because part of them knows that they would lose a significant market share. And I think they're right about Donald Trump. I mean, it's just, the guy's always been a marketing genius. It's just marketing genius to sell a Trump Bible. It's just marketing genius. I mean, if you can sell the King James Version, which has been in public domain before we had ideas of public domain, for $60, yeah, the guy's a salesman. But what I hear from churches like the Christian Reformed Church, who especially in the 90s and early aughts were getting their butts kicked by seeker big box churches, is that churches are going to have to figure out formation, catechesis, in a much more serious way, but they're also going to have to deal with the mimetic realities in the world. And this is where I think we have to give the Orthodox and the Catholics some props, because it's true that in many ways, as Sam said in a previous live stream, you would think Protestants would really succeed on YouTube, but they don't. Catholics are strong and the Orthodox are super strong. And you would think that the Orthodox would be, would sort of shun YouTube. But boy, they sort of lean in all the way in a lot of ways and are reaping a harvest from it, even if they're going to really struggle to do the catechesis and formation, which might lead to a very interesting, strange dynamic in American religiosity. Not only do you have sort of non-denominational Christians downstream of Methodism and Baptist churches and Southern Presbyterianism, but you'll get what will big box evangelical orthodoxy look like? Because the truth is, that will come. And it sounds crazy, but we're living in crazy times. So that's enough for now. Time to make a thumbnail. Time to put this out during homeroom. Poor Grizz, he doesn't get his homeroom videos. What's he supposed to do? So leave a comment. We'll see how this goes.